Studio 6B, NBC, Burbank, May 1976. The cigarette smoke had settled into horizontal layers beneath the stage lights, held there by the precision of the ventilation system that had learned over 11 years exactly how to manage the atmosphere of the room where America went to bed. The audience murmur dropped to silence not because anyone commanded it, but because 20 million homes were doing the same thing at the same moment, and the people in those seats understood they were the live chorus for a national ritual. Johnny Carson touched the knot of his tie, a gesture so small the studio audience never noticed it, but one his director had learned meant the host was recalibrating something internal, some frequency only he could hear. The guest chair, positioned at precisely 47 degrees to camera 2, waited empty. In 3 minutes, Muhammad Ali would walk through that curtain and the machinery of American television would attempt what it had failed to do for a decade: contain him. By the spring of 1976, appearing on The Tonight Show was not an interview, it was a referendum. Carson had become something television had never produced before, a man whose approval could not be purchased, manufactured, or intimidated into existence. He did not launch careers through enthusiasm, he laundered them through withholding judgment. Politicians appeared on his show not to win votes, but to prove they could survive his attention. Actors came not to promote films, but to demonstrate they possessed something beyond their studio biographies, some fragment of authenticity that could survive 6 minutes of exposure to Carson's particular frequency of silence. The show's power resided not in its questions, but in its pauses, the 3-second gaps where Carson's face remained perfectly neutral and the guest had to choose whether to fill the void with honesty or performance. America watched those silences the way a cardiac unit watches a monitor. What the machine revealed, the machine believed. Muhammad Ali had been on the show before, twice in 1974, once in early 1975, but those appearances had followed the script Ali himself had written across 2 decades of media performance, the rope-a-dope of language, the dance of self-mythology. He had come with poems, predictions, and the bright armor of invincibility that had made him, simultaneously, the most loved and most threatening athlete America had ever produced. Carson had played along, as he always did with performers who came prepared, because the show's architecture could absorb anything rehearsed. But something had shifted in the months since their last encounter. Ali had fought Joe Frazier in Manila 7 months earlier, a contest so brutal that Howard Cosell had called it the closest thing to death he had ever witnessed in sport. Ali had won, but the victory had come at a cost that registered in his face, in the slight delay now present in his speech, in the way his hands moved more carefully than they once had. He was 34 years old, which in the language of heavyweight boxing meant he was aging in double time, and everyone who understood the sport knew the shadow had entered the ring with him now, knew it was only a question of when it would stay. The audience expected the performance. They expected the Ali who could make Carson laugh, who could transform an interview into a vaudeville routine, who could predict the round of his next opponent's defeat with such rhythmic certainty that the prediction itself became the event. What they did not expect, what no one in that studio or in the 20 million homes could have anticipated, was that Ali would arrive without his mask, and that Carson, who had spent 15 years learning how to keep his own mask perfectly aligned, would have no protocol for what to do when the performance stopped. It began normally enough. The introduction, the applause, Ali moving through the curtain with the remnant of his old grace, the handshake, the settling into the chair. Carson opened with the standard question, something about the next fight, and Ali responded with something that sounded like his usual cadence but wasn't. The rhythm was there, but the music beneath it had changed key. Then Carson asked about fear, not as a rhetorical question, but as a genuine inquiry, and the studio atmosphere altered in a way the cameras could not quite capture, but the audience felt immediately. Ali stopped. Not the performative stop, the pause before the punchline, but a full cessation of the machinery that had been running without interruption since 1960. He looked at Carson, and for the first time in anyone's memory, Muhammad Ali spoke about terror. He described the night before the Frazier fight in Manila,
the hotel room, the inability to sleep, the knowledge that in less than 12 hours he would step into a space where another man, a man who had beaten him once already, a man who wanted to hurt him not just physically but existentially, would attempt to erase him. Ali said he had been afraid for every fight of his career. Not nervous, not anxious, afraid. The kind of fear that makes the body want to run, that makes the mind search for exits, that makes a man question every decision that led to this particular moment of inescapable consequence. He said the fear never diminished with experience, it only became more familiar, and the only thing that changed was his knowledge that he would have to walk through it anyway, that there was no detour around it, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to continue functioning.
Carson's face did what it almost never did on camera. It dropped the professional neutrality that was his signature instrument. For approximately 90 seconds, an eternity in the time signature of network television, he simply listened, and his listening was so complete that it registered as a kind of vulnerability. The audience, trained by 1,000 episodes to laugh at specific intervals, did not laugh. The director, trained to cut to reaction shots during emotional moments, held on the two-shot, understanding intuitively that what was happening could not be improved by technique. America, watching from living rooms and bedrooms and hospital waiting rooms, leaned forward in the involuntary way people do when they recognize they are witnessing something unrehearsed. What Ali was describing was not unique to boxing. He was articulating the condition of performance itself, the gap between the public presentation and the private experience, the cost of maintaining the image that others require you to inhabit. And Carson, who had built the most successful career in television history by never revealing that gap, by making the performance appear effortless and the persona appear identical to the person, was hearing his own unspoken experience described back to him by a man who had chosen, for reasons that were not entirely clear, to stop pretending. The mask had not slipped by accident. Ali had removed it deliberately, and by doing so, he had created a situation where Carson had to choose whether to meet him in that undefended space or retreat into the professional distance that was always available. Carson chose to stay. He asked a follow-up question, but the question was not an interview technique. It was a genuine request for information, the kind of question you ask when you actually do not know the answer and want to understand. He asked Ali what happened to the fear once the bell rang, once the fight began and the theoretical became actual. Ali said the fear never left, but it became operational rather than paralyzing. He said you learn to move with it, to let it sharpen your attention rather than scatter it, to accept that it will be there in the corner with you and that your job is not to defeat it, but to prevent it from defeating you. He said this quietly, without the performance rhythm, and Carson nodded in a way that suggested he was translating the answer into his own context, into the experience of walking through the curtain every night for 15 years, into the fear that what you have built could collapse at any moment because it is built on nothing more permanent than other people's willingness to keep watching. The conversation lasted less than 8 minutes in total, but within that span, something had been exchanged that was not part of the show's usual economy. The transaction was not entertainment, it was recognition. Two men who had spent their entire adult lives performing in front of audiences, who had become synonymous with their public images, who had made their bodies and minds into instruments for other people's expectations, had briefly acknowledged to each other and to 20 million witnesses that the performance was not the whole truth, and that the cost of maintaining it was higher than anyone who had not paid it could understand. The show continued. They spoke about lighter topics. Ali delivered a poem, though it was quieter than usual. Carson laughed, though the laugh was different, more personal, less produced. When the segment ended and they cut to commercial, Carson did something he rarely did. He stood and shook Ali's hand again, and held it for a moment longer than the rhythm of the show required. The audience applauded, but the applause had a different quality, less celebratory and more respectful, as if they understood they had been present for something that was not quite entertainment and not quite confession, but some third category that American television had not yet named.
In the control room, the director made a note to pull the tape for the archive, understanding that what had just occurred would eventually be studied, though he could not have articulated exactly what had been captured. The network executives, reviewing the broadcast the next morning, were uncertain whether the segment had been good television or a violation of the unspoken contract that late-night programming was supposed to provide comfort, not confrontation. The ratings were strong, but the audience response was difficult to categorize. People called in not to praise or criticize, but to ask questions about what they had seen, as if they needed help interpreting an experience that had fallen outside the standard vocabulary of television viewership. What had happened was this: Ali had told the truth about fear, and in doing so had created a space where Carson's own fear, the fear of being exposed, of the mask failing, of the audience discovering that the ease was constructed, became briefly visible, not as weakness, but as the human cost of the particular kind of excellence both men had achieved. The desk that separated them, the barrier that maintained the host-guest hierarchy and protected Carson from the chaos of uncontrolled intimacy, had become irrelevant for those 2 minutes. The microphone that amplified their words also amplified their shared understanding that the words themselves were secondary to what was being acknowledged beneath them.
The segment was never rebroadcast in Carson's lifetime. It appeared occasionally in retrospectives, usually edited down to 30 seconds, the context removed and the moment reduced to a soundbite about Ali's honesty. But the people who had watched it live, or who had access to the full archive footage, understood that what had made it significant was not Ali's revelation — athletes had spoken about fear before — but Carson's response. The way his professional architecture had briefly allowed something undefended to show through, and the way that moment of transparency had revealed how much energy he spent every night keeping that transparency from occurring. Years later, after Carson had retired and the machinery of The Tonight Show had been handed to other operators who would never quite master its particular frequency, people who studied television history would return to that May 1976 episode as an example of what live broadcasting could occasionally achieve, a moment where the constructed nature of the medium became visible, and in becoming visible, allowed something true to occur. They would note that Carson never referenced the interview in his monologues, never used it as material, never turned it into the kind of self-referential content that television usually extracts from its own memorable moments. It existed as a singular event, unrepeated and unrepeatable, because both participants had to choose simultaneously to abandon the script, and that simultaneous choice was not something that could be engineered or predicted. Muhammad Ali fought 6 more times. He won 4, lost 2, and then retired, though he would return twice more, each comeback more painful to witness than the last, until finally the sport he had mastered and the body that had made him mythological both refused to continue the performance. Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 16 more years, refining the mask until it became indistinguishable from his face, until even people who worked with him daily could not say with certainty where the performance ended and the person began. He never dropped the mask again on camera, or if he did, it was so subtle that only the most attentive viewers noticed, and they, like the audience that night in May 1976, understood they were witnessing something that was not meant to be analyzed, but simply observed and respected. The desk remained, the microphone remained, the curtain that separated the backstage from the performance space remained. These were the tools of Carson's authority, the physical manifestations of the control he exercised over the national conversation every night at 11:30. But for 2 minutes in the spring of 1976, they had been irrelevant, and what had replaced them was the older, more fundamental exchange that occurs when one person tells another person the truth about cost, and the second person understands that the truth being told is also their own. America had watched, not entirely understanding what it was seeing, knowing only that something had shifted, that the evening had produced a moment that could not be categorized as comedy or drama or interview, but was instead a brief acknowledgement of the mechanism underneath all those categories, the fear that precedes the performance,
the choice to walk through the fear anyway, and the exhaustion that waits on the other side of applause. The broadcast ended. The studio lights dimmed. The audience filed out into the Burbank night, carrying with them a memory they would not fully understand until years later, when they recognized it as the moment they had seen the seam in the illusion, and the illusion had somehow become more valuable for being revealed as constructed, because what it revealed was not deception, but discipline, not falsehood, but the tremendous effort required to make the difficult appear effortless. The tape remained in the archive, the moment remained in the record, and the desk, Carson's desk, the piece of furniture that had separated him from 10,000 guests across 3 decades, remained in its place, an altar to the religion of American performance, where the congregation gathered every night to witness the same miracle, a man making fear invisible, making the mask appear to be the face, making the nation believe that the distance between who we are and who we appear to be is a distance that can be crossed without cost, without consequence, without the kind of courage that only becomes visible when someone chooses, for reasons known only to themselves, to stop pretending.